Ladies and gentlemen, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from today in the world. On behalf of the Foundation for IT Sustainability, we would like to welcome you to International Green IT Awareness Week for 2012. Thank you for joining us for this very special live presentation. We're glad that you could join us today. My name is Tim Martin, a project manager with the Foundation for IT Sustainability, and I'm going to give a quick overview of today's session and also walk through some housekeeping items. Then I'll turn it over to our featured presenter, Graeme Philipson of Connection Research, who will introduce himself and his topic and start the presentation for us. As you may know, International Green IT Awareness Week was founded and is sponsored by the Foundation for IT Sustainability, which is a global non-profit organisation. Our mission is to reduce the negative impacts of technology on the environment and promote the sustainable use of technology to help solve environmental problems. We achieve this by educating individuals, corporations and government, promoting the implementation of green IT best practices, as well as encouraging the development of more sustainable technology alternatives. If you haven't heard of us before, please do visit us on the web at the address provided at the end of the presentation. Today we have Graeme Philipson of Connection Research joining us to present his topic entitled The Global IT Sustainability Index. Graeme will present his material, a copy of which is also available now in PDF format on this session's registration page, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. We'd ask that if you do have any questions throughout the presentation, please submit them in the question panel on the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen, and we shall answer your questions at the end of the presentation. With that, I'll now go ahead and turn it over to Graeme to introduce himself and his presentation for today.
Thanks, Tim, and good morning, everybody. Thanks, Tim. Good morning, everybody, or good evening, or good afternoon. My name, as Tim said, is Graeme Philipson. I'm the Research Director and founder of Connection Research. We're based in Australia, but we do research globally about green IT, or what we prefer to call ICT sustainability. We founded this company a few years ago, and we have concentrated on trying to understand the dynamics of sustainability. Most of us come from the IT industry, and our background is in IT, market research and market analysis. Indeed, I used to work for Gartner, the large IT consultancy. So part of what we're trying to do is bring some of the disciplines of IT, market research and market analysis into sustainability. And of course, IT and sustainability cross over in something called green IT, or as I say, what we prefer to call IT or ICT sustainability. My presentation today is called How Countries Compare, the Global ICT Sustainability Index. We've developed a methodology that allows us to quantify the extent to which organisations are doing green IT. And we've surveyed people around the world, IT departments, and what I'll be doing today, presenting how the survey looked last year, the most recent one we've done, and also how different countries compare. First of all, let's just look at the importance of IT. A lot of you have probably seen this slide. It comes out of the very well-known Smart 2020 report from a couple of years ago. Without going into detail about the slide, it basically says that IT has the potential to save 5 times its own emissions. If IT is responsible for 1 or 2% of the world's carbon emissions, which is sort of the consensus, and that's actually been proven by some analysis we've done, and just say it's 2% or 1.4% as this report says, well, IT or IT-enabled technologies and business practices could be responsible for reducing about 1/3 of all the 30% of carbon emissions we need to do to get down to 2002 levels by 2020. IT, green IT is important. Reducing the carbon impact of the IT function is important, but even if we halved it, that would only take about 1%, half to 1% off the world's carbon emissions. The real effect that IT can have is its enabling capabilities, which can exceed that figure by a factor of 5 or 10 or more. So important bit of preamble, I think, because there's really two aspects to green IT. It's making IT more sustainable, and it's using IT as a way to make the economy and society and the planet more sustainable. So that's a pretty important aspect, and I wanted to mention it as a preamble. I mentioned earlier that we'd actually proven done some analysis of the amount of energy or electricity that IT uses. We did a report, a study in Australia recently. Now, Australia is reasonably indicative of the Western world in terms of its usage of IT or ICT, and we did a large report for the Australian Computer Society 18 months ago now, where we computed the energy consumption of every computer and peripheral and data centre in Australia, and we found that the total carbon emissions of IT in Australia came to 2.7% of all carbon emissions. So the world figure of 2% is probably quite right, given that Australia is a very carbon-intensive country. Discount that a bit for other countries. So that's 2% or 2.7% of carbon emissions, but more importantly, it's 7% of all electricity consumption. Only about a third of carbon emissions come from electricity consumption. The rest is, cars and things like that. So it's quite a high figure. But it's 7% overall, but for large organisations in the service industries like banks and government departments, the figure can be as much as a half or more. We found one large bank that had computed that about 2/3 of all of their carbon emissions came from their IT function, and about a half of that, so 1/3 in total, from the data centre. So it's a very, very large figure. I don't need to preach to this audience about the importance of green IT, but the figures are actually quite a bit higher than a lot of people realise. It's very significant. Here's our breakdown of the actual usage of the breakdown of the proportion of different devices, IT devices and IT functions, what proportion of the total IT carbon footprint they comprise, because not a lot of people have done this sort of analysis. And there's some interesting data here. PCs are about 16% of the total. That's PCs without screens. More and more PCs, of course, now are laptops, but there's still a lot of desktops around. If you add the 10% down the bottom right-hand corner of the pie chart there, adding the 10% or so that's video monitors, and PCs and their video monitors is about a quarter of all energy consumption of IT. The other really big one is data center environment. You see that segment on the top left there, 18.8%, and that's the computer room air conditioners and power supply and such like in the data center. Very, very high figure. There's a lot of work going on in data centers to reduce that figure. That's where the PUE, some of you may be aware of, the power usage effectiveness figure comes from, the proportion of that figure to all the other figures in the data center. But you see some other interesting stuff here. Printers and imaging equipment is 15%. Networking equipment is about 7%. The network infrastructure, the telco backbone, is about 9%. So there's a whole range of different devices and technologies. Games consoles, they don't by themselves use very much, but there's millions of games consoles, and a lot of these kids that use them don't turn them off. So games consoles are about 5% of the total. Add it all together, and you've got a massive amount of energy consumption. That sees how it's broken down. Mobile devices, phones and iPads and the like, not terribly significant, though obviously it's all part of the big total. So that gives us an idea about, A, the importance of the reduction of the energy consumption of the IT function, and also how the energy consumption is distributed. Now I want to look at the core topic of today's presentation, which is the ICT Sustainability Framework. Now, we've developed this framework as a way of defining ICT, or green ICT, or IT sustainability, call it what you will. And we say there's four types, or four key components to green IT. There's the equipment lifecycle, which is essentially procurement and disposal. There's end user computing, which is that part of the IT function under the control of the end user. There's enterprise and data center, which is essentially that part of the IT function under the control of the IT department. And there's the very important fourth pillar here, which is the one I was talking about earlier, which is the usage of IT, ICT as a low-carbon enabler. And each of those is a very important part of green IT. Now, you've probably heard lots of different definitions of green IT. We don't try and define it, not verbally anyway. We say it's got all of these different components. You can see within this framework that each of the four pillars had a number of components within it. Enterprise and data center, we just looked at data center environmentals, for example, in that pie chart. So that's one of the key components also there. And across these four verticals, we have a number of what we call practices. There's your attitude towards green IT. There's your policies that you may have adopted. Do you have a policy in place for this or a policy in place for that? What practices have you put in place? A lot of green IT is about things you do, not about the technologies. Technology is important, but it's only one aspect of it. For example, turning your PCs off at night is a practice. Putting into place a piece of PC management software that does it automatically is a technology. So that's the distinction we make there. Then underlying all of this, we have metrics. How well do you measure all of this stuff? How well do you measure how well you're doing lifecycle and end-user computing and enterprise and data center and the enablement? So metrics is one of the, we use those four vertical pillars as components of green IT, and metrics, which is across all four pillars, is essentially our fifth key component. Metrics is important because there's an old saying in business, you can't manage what you can't measure. Very, very true, and especially true of green IT. So metrics becomes important where we want to see how well we're measuring. We need to measure it, we need to monitor, which is really continuous measurement or replicable measurement. And only once we've measured can we start to manage and then ultimately hopefully mitigate or reduce the effects of green IT. Okay, so benchmarking green IT. The title of this presentation is comparing green IT or international comparison. So from our framework, we can then do an analysis of how well someone is doing each aspect of green IT. So we use a thing called the capability maturity model, which has been widely used in the IT industry to quantify or bring some metrics to behaviour and performance, often used in the software industry. And we apply that capability maturity model across each of those five aspects, the four verticals that we just looked at, and metrics. And then we can determine how useful or how mature, it's a useful mechanism for determining how mature each of those aspects of green IT are. And the great advantage of this methodology, given that it's quantitative, is that we can then compare how well or how mature or how advanced practices and technologies are in each of these five areas. And we can use demographic analysis to do comparison by industry sector, by size of organisation, or by country. Now here's a standard capability maturity model as used in many different parts of the software industry and increasingly in other areas of technology and indeed of business practices. And it's a pretty simple concept. It basically says there are 6 levels, or 5 levels plus 0, of how well you're doing any business process or any sort of technology implementation. 0, you've never thought about it, you've got no awareness at all, no intention, it's just not on your radar. Level 1, initial, you've thought about it, you know it's there, but you haven't done anything. 2 is replicable. Yes, we're doing it, we've started to implement it, but there's no real strategy. Strategy comes into place with definition. Level 3, you've defined it, you've started to bring some metrics to it, but you haven't done, it's still comparatively immature. Level 4 is managed, it's reasonably mature, it's been practiced and managed, and then level 5 is optimized. You're doing it as well as you really can, it's been properly measured, and it's what is often called best practice. So what we do with this this methodology is that we apply the capability maturity model across every aspect of that IT sustainability framework, which then allows us to do comparisons. The way we do that is by doing a survey. We survey CIOs to ask them about how mature their practices are in every aspect of green IT. Now, here's a sample page from the report that we do that analyses someone's green IT sustainability index. And you can't read the words, but you can see on the right there, that's an example of how well someone's doing a whole lot of different practices in the data center. They might be a level 5 best practice, which is the dark green at the top, or they could not do it at all down at the bottom with no mark at all. So by quantifying, by asking enough questions, we can then quantify the extent to which someone is implementing green IT across those 5 areas that we just looked at: lifecycle, end user, enterprise, enablement, and metrics, how well they're measuring it all. So the 5 key components. For each component, we come up with an index based on the survey, which then allows us to do very detailed comparisons of how well organisations are implementing each of these 5 aspects of green IT, and more importantly, how well they do compared to their peers or compared to other organisations in their industry sector or of their size or in their country. So for the last 3 years, Fujitsu, big Japanese IT vendor, has sponsored this research worldwide. And last year, we surveyed 1,000 organisations across 7 countries: Australia, Canada, China, India, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the USA. Now, very detailed analysis. We're now undertaking the 2012 benchmark. It's just an unfortunate aspect of the timing of International Green IT Awareness Week that we're sort of at the end of the cycle here. We are currently researching the 2012 data. But the 2011 data is still very comprehensive and very important, and it shows us the comparisons. We do find that things don't change enormously year on year. So what we're about to see is the analysis from the most recent completed survey. So let's have a look at it. It basically looks at every aspect of green IT performance as defined by our framework, the 4 pillars plus measurement or metrics, and allows us to do some detailed comparisons. Now, here is the overall international comparison in 2010 and 2011 for the 5 components of the framework. We rate things on a scale of 1 to 5 using the capability maturity model, and then the average response in each area is multiplied by 20 to give us an index out of 100. That's how this is derived. And you can see that from 2010 to 2011, there was a very small decline in the level of ICT sustainability or green IT worldwide. Lifecycle improved. In other words, people got a bit better at doing procurement and disposal in an environmentally friendly fashion, but there was a slight decline in most other areas. End user went backwards. Enterprise just a little backwards, though the previous year had gone up enormously. Enablement and metrics both declined also. And we'll look later on at why there may have been a bit of a decline. We are currently doing this year's Green IT Global Index. It's still in the field, but we've had a look at a bit of preliminary data, and it would seem that once again green IT maturity has declined worldwide, but we're not sure about that yet. It's just some preliminary analysis. And as I said, we'll talk later on about why that might be the case. But it is a fact, and this has been the case every year that we've done this analysis, that the larger the organisation is, the higher their index. In other words, the better they're doing green IT. And it's a very strong correlation. The bigger you are, the better you are. The reason for this is quite simple. Larger organisations have more resources. They have the capability of implementing a lot of the technologies and practices more than small organisations do. They're large enough to have dedicated staff for this area, large enough to have a team that can do the metrics, and for every one of those index components, we find that larger organisations outperform smaller organisations, just a fact of life. The interesting analysis by country, Here's the breakdown. We find that of the countries that we surveyed, the highest rating country was Canada. Now we all know they're pretty green up there in Canada when they're not snowbound, and this is reflected in their IT sustainability index. The UK comes second, a bit behind Canada, followed by the USA. USA does well largely because of the higher proportion of large organisations in the US. They tend to be larger companies with larger IT departments, and as we saw earlier, the bigger the IT department, the greener it tends to be, all other things being equal. Next comes Australia, but all the other countries are below the international average shown at the bottom of this chart, 54.3 across all countries. Australia is a bit better than New Zealand. Again, New Zealand is hampered a bit by the fact that most of its IT user organisations tend to be small country with small organisations and small IT departments. India down the track a bit. Rest of the world, we surveyed some other countries, but not enough for any of them to be separately analysed. And finally, China is the least mature. Now, you pretty well expect that India and China growing very quickly, but IT implementation in those countries tends to be a bit less mature than in the Western world, where IT has been around for a lot longer, or IT departments are usually a bit larger and a bit more established. So pretty well what you'd expect. There's a reasonably good correlation or reason behind all of these breakdowns by country. When you look at the industry breakdown, again, there's no real surprises, but it's interesting to see the relativity of different industry sectors. The best performing sector overall is IT and communications and media. And again, it's a fair way ahead. It's significantly ahead of most other industry sectors, mostly because this is, by definition, the most tech-savvy of all industry sectors. Their IT tends to be more technologically advanced, and we find that that's correlates with and goes hand in hand with IT sustainability maturity, green IT maturity. Second is government, which you'd expect also, because government tends to be more regulated or certainly have more policies and more policy implementation than private sector organisations. Then the utilities, construction, mining may surprise some people. They do pretty well. Financial services, banks, insurance companies, etc., on about the industry average. They should be higher, really, because they're very IT-intensive organisations. They're larger organisations as a rule, but they're no real better than average. And then we fall down to below average performance. Wholesale, retail, logistics, professional services, mostly because they're pretty small organisations. Health, education and welfare, that's hospitals, education institutions, etc. Falling down a bit, they tend to have very fragmented IT, and it's hard with a fragmented IT department to bring a lot of policies and procedures into place. And then the dirtiest of all of the, least mature of all the industry sectors is manufacturing, which is consistently poor and behind the pace in most countries because they don't care much about sustainability. It's a pretty dirty process, and you can go so far as to say non-environmental mindset in most manufacturing. Relatively speaking, there's not an enormous differential between the best and worst performing industries, but it is noticeable. Now, when we do the breakdown by the 5 industry or index components that we discussed as part of the framework, we see that internationally overall, the best performing index component is Lifecycle, procurement and disposal. This stuff's been around for a while. People have talked about environmentally friendly disposal practices since long before we started to talk about green IT. It doesn't show up in this data, but we do find that procurement tends to have a better performance than disposal tends to have a better performance than procurement as a part of this index component. The next is end user. End user green IT practices are a bit above, about on a par with enterprise ones. These are the 2 parts of green IT which are operational, if you like. This is where a lot of people sort of, for many people, green IT starts and ends. It's on how well you do your IT operations. End user is stuff like how well you turn your PCs off at night, you have PC power management, how well you do your printing, and your printing process is environmentally sound, you turn your screensavers off, those sorts of technologies and practices. Enterprise is the big one. It's data centers and how good's your PUE, have you implemented server virtualization, hot aisle, cold aisle, a whole range of different technologies and practices. Then we fall off the pace a bit. Enablement is a bit below average, below the overall IT sustainability index average, down at about 52%. That's an index, remember, so that means that most people sort of ticking the boxes for that component of the survey. They're only ticking, it's coming in about 2.5 out of 5 on average. Most people don't consider enablement as part of the green IT strategy. But as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, it's probably the most important because it's enablement where IT can have the biggest effect on reducing carbon footprint and increasing or enhancing energy efficiency. And then a long way behind the others is metrics. People generally don't measure how well they're doing green IT. Obviously, we've developed this methodology that allows us to really measure how well someone's doing. We can even measure how poorly they're measuring stuff. And metrics generally is the poor cousin. It is where most organisations don't really do much in terms of effectiveness of their looking at how well they do these things. And it's important because, as I said earlier, and as we all know, you can't manage what you can't measure. So if you're not measuring how effective your green IT is, or how effective your implementation of various sustainability practices and technologies are, well, then you can't really begin to determine how effective those measures are. So sad but true, metrics is last on the list in terms of the maturity of green IT. Now, I mentioned earlier that we found that from 2010 to 2011, and it looks probable again in 2012, that green IT maturity overall around the world is declining, very slightly, but declining a little. And why is this? Well, there's a couple of reasons for it, we believe. The first one is what we call the low-hanging fruit syndrome. I think all the low-hanging fruit's been picked and now it's grown back. This is the term that's often used to describe the fact that you look for the easy wins first. The low-hanging fruit is an analogy of an orchard. So you'll pick the apples and pears that are easiest to get rather than climb up a ladder. So things like turning your PCs off at night, easy to do, easy to implement, but unfortunately a lot of people regard green IT as a project, not as a process. So they'll say, oh, we've done that now, tick the box, we've done green IT, we've done ICT sustainability, so we don't have to do it again. But of course it's not a project, it's not a one-off, it's a process, it's a mindset. The old term, it's not a destination, it's a journey, you've got to keep doing it. And one thing we think has happened is that a lot of people, green IT was sort of flavour of the month a couple of years ago, flavour of the year, and people said, oh, I've done that, and now moved on doing something else. And that's a phenomenon that's part of what Gartner, the big research consultancy that I used to work for once, referred to as the hype cycle. Gartner has this concept that any technology or any sort of business practice goes through a hype cycle. People get really excited about it when it first comes out, gets a lot of publicity, the journalists write about it, the consultants consult about it, and it sort of becomes exciting. But at the same time that people are talking about it, it's not widely implemented. Then people get sick of it, there's a new flavour of the month, a new kid on the block, and people go and talk about something else. And as that happens, implementation, or certainly the profile of this technology, declines. It goes down to what Gartner calls the trough of disillusionment. People get, oh, that didn't work as well as it should. It's gone off the boil. But then what happens over time is that things become more widely used, becomes part of the mainstream, and but not widely commented on, not because it's not used or not being widely used, but because it's just so widely used it's not worth remarking upon. We believe that green IT, ICT sustainability is probably at the bottom of Gartner's hype cycle right now. It's and that's one of the reasons it's declined. It's got less profile. We know from our research that a lot of people are saying it's not a high priority to us anymore. But as energy prices go up, as Gartner's hype cycle sort of takes hold, that usage and indeed profile of green IT and ICT sustainability will continue to rise again. This is a very common phenomenon. Another reason why ICT sustainability may have gone off the boil a bit is because of the failure of, or the fact that sustainability generally is not as fashionable as it was. We saw the failure of Copenhagen, the big conference a year or two ago. We see the unfortunate growth in climate change denialism around the world, driven by the loony right in the Republican Party in the US, by certain parts of the press, for ideological rather than scientific regions. I think most people listening to this podcast would agree that climate change is real, but all the data shows that the data shows that it's real, and the data also shows that an increasing number of people are denying its existence. A real paradox, but unfortunately the case. And I mentioned the US just now; they're not doing anything. So you put it all together, and you find there's a reasonably good explanation for why green IT is not as fashionable as it once was. But our analysis shows that there's another very, very strong reason why this is the case. That is that IT's power consumption is rarely part of the IT budget. We know that power consumption is going up, even with practices like virtualization. Increased processing power means that the general energy consumption of the IT process is increasing, it's not decreasing. And at the same time that it's increasing, electricity costs in most countries around the world are increasing. So that means that the overall energy bill of the IT function, the overall energy consumption and the cost of that consumption is increasing. But we find that the power consumption of the IT function is very rarely part of the IT budget. Here's the data from our survey. We obviously asked lots of questions to get our index components, but some of the questions are broken down. This is a capability maturity model, but it also allows us to look at the percentage of respondents to each component. And we see that only about 14%, which is 1 in 7, only 1 in 7 IT departments includes the cost of the power consumption of IT in its operating budget. So human nature tells you that if you're not responsible for the cost of something, you're not going to have any interest in reducing the cost of it. 86% of IT departments can use as much electricity as they want and not get charged for it. So it's only natural that they won't have much interest in reducing their power bill. It's only when their IT power bill is included in their IT budget that they start to take action, or they're more likely to take action. You can see that, look at those top 2 bars on this bar chart. Most IT departments, half of IT departments, 53%, have got no idea how much energy they're consuming. And you see the other third or so, the 2 middle bars, they know how much they're consuming, but it's not part of their budget. So why would they bother? I firmly believe, a personal view, that IT sustainability, green IT, won't take off in a big way until more and more IT departments include the power consumption of IT in their budget, because then they'll have a real interest in reducing it. Until then, they won't. This figure is going up year on year. Every year we've done the survey, a higher proportion of organisations include IT in their operating, the power consumption of IT in their operating budget, but it's a slow increase. We are now getting the tools and the techniques, the metering devices, etc., in place that allow people to do that. But we're able, through our research, to do some very interesting analysis. Let's look. Here's the chart in front of you here of the proportion of IT departments that include IT in the cost of IT power consumption in their budget, on a graded scale. But let's look at this. Here's the breakdown of the IT Sustainability Index, the overall index, broken down by the amount of visibility of of IT energy consumption. You can see there's a very strong correlation here between visibility of IT's power consumption and how well somebody does on the IT Sustainability Index. If you've got total responsibility, your index is up at 65%. If you've never even thought about the energy consumption, it's down at 45%. You can see the different overall indices as we go through the different levels of the visibility of power bill. So it's a very, very strong correlation. And as I said, one of the key reasons we believe why green IT is not higher on most people's agenda. It's very high on your agenda if you're paying for your power consumption. If you're not paying for your power consumption, well, it's not on your agenda because what's it matter to you? That's the end of the presentation. I don't have a sort of big closing slide with the key points, but let me reiterate what they are. There's my contact details. I'm happy to talk to anybody anytime about this stuff. Email me, phone me. But just reiterating there, IT is important. Well, we know that. IT's power consumption is important. It's about 2% of all carbon emissions in the world are caused by IT. More importantly, about 7% of all electricity consumption is taken up by IT. That's much higher in many organisations, up to half or more in white-collar organisations that use IT as a way of doing business. We have a way of measuring this using those components of green IT, the 5 elements of our framework, which are Lifecycle, End User, Enterprise, Enablement and Metrics, and we've developed a methodology for quantifying the maturity of green IT by applying metrics against that framework. And through a survey, we can survey over 1,000 IT departments worldwide to get comparative metrics between industry sectors and even industry sectors within country. We've broken this down quite significantly. You can go to Fujitsu's website and download that Global ICT Sustainability Report, which has all the details. So that's it from me, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of the formal part of this presentation. I'm now happy to take any questions from anybody. Thanks, Tim. Thanks everybody.
Great. Thank you very much, Graeme, for that very thought-provoking and insightful presentation. I'm sure everyone in attendance and viewing this video later will certainly get a lot out of that information. So as Graeme mentioned, we will now commence the Q&A portion of our live speaker session. If you do have any questions that you would like to ask Graeme about his presentation, or perhaps his work with Connection Research, or his experiences in general with green IT or sustainable ICT, then please submit your questions now in the question box in the webinar control panel. Graeme will be able to address each of those questions in turn. And please remember, if you would like to speak with Graeme or a representative of the Foundation for IT Sustainability, please feel free to email info@bits.org at any time following this session, and we'll be more than happy to assist your query following the conclusion of today's session. Alternatively, as Graeme mentioned, his contact details are now up on the screen, so be sure to note those down before we conclude. So now on to the questions. The first question we have for you, Graeme, is why are so many organisations struggling with green IT?
Yeah, well, I sort of addressed it a little bit in my presentation. I think that issue of the lack of visibility of green IT is important, but also just consider the lot of the IT manager, the CIO. I mean, they're very, very busy people. They've got all sorts of agenda items. In most places around the world, people are under severe financial constraints. Budgets are dropping, accountability is increasing, and there's a lot on the agenda. And unfortunately, and we see this not just in IT, but across the board, sustainability tends to be a nice to have rather than a must have. There's no money in it, even though we know that saving energy saves money. It's you've got to put in effort up front to get the reward down the track, and it tends to be a lower agenda item. Not until the polar ice caps melt and sea levels go up by a metre are we going to see comprehensive action on climate change worldwide. similarly, not until real effects are had on the IT department or the IT function, I think, will we see a lot of behaviour. But it's going to happen because electricity costs are not going to go down. The power consumption of IT is not going to go down. We're approaching what I've heard referred to as a perfect storm when it comes to IT sustainability. The thing about current IT practices is that they're simply not sustainable, and that realisation will start to hit as we climb back up the hype cycle, and things will turn around. But unfortunately, right at the moment, that's not the case.
Great, thanks, Graeme. The next question we have is, what prompted Fujitsu to launch the inaugural survey, and how does it differ from other indices such as the Dow Jones Sustainability Index?
Well, the Fujitsu survey is IT only. It's we put together the methodology. Fujitsu actually looked worldwide to look for some metrics for IT sustainability, and ours was the only one that fit the bill. We developed it independently, but Fujitsu has now been sponsoring it and funding it. Now, Fujitsu themselves are a very, very sustainable organisation. Fujitsu has would you believe, a sustainability policy out to 2050. Like a lot of Asian companies, their time frames are much broader, much longer than Western organisations. You know, most US companies are governed by the tyranny of the quarterly investment cycle, the quarterly reporting cycle, and have very short-term views. So Fujitsu has a very mature and very sophisticated international sustainability practice and agenda, and of all major IT companies worldwide is probably the best, or certainly one of the best in terms of sustainability. So we're very happy, obviously, that they've sponsored this research worldwide. They're doing it again this year. So that's essentially why Fujitsu are doing. But the point you made about the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, this is specifically an IT sustainability index. There's no other such index globally. I'm sure if there was, we wouldn't have heard of it.
Excellent. Thanks, Graeme. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about why some countries seem to do better than others when it comes to green ICT.
Yeah, again, I alluded to this briefly in the presentation, but there's a couple of different factors. One is the size of the organisation. I made the point that New Zealand's down the list a bit, and the US is up the list a bit, whereas most people would regard New Zealand as a country where sustainability is much higher on the agenda than it is in the US. That's certainly the case. That's a function of the size of the IT department. Larger IT departments do better because they have more resources, and they can dedicate an individual or even a team to green IT. Plus, larger organisations tend to have better visibility of the importance or the cost of energy consumption from the IT function. So it's a combination of things. And the other one is just simply the maturity. Excuse me, the maturity of the IT operations. We saw that China was towards the bottom of the list, and it is a function not of China being a particularly unsustainable country, but a function of the relative maturity of the not just IT but of business practices in China. We know that China is industrializing very quickly. And to do that, they've put in a lot of very dirty coal-fired power stations, but we now see that China is also at the forefront of solar energy and of so-called clean coal, and that China's catching up very quickly. So it's a function of not so much of national characteristic, but of the relative size of IT organisations and the relative maturity of IT departments in terms of the technological implementation.
Thanks very much, Graeme. I guess the next question I have in mind is, which areas of green IT are the most mature, and the reasons for that?
Again, briefly alluded to in the presentation, but I'm very happy to take these questions because it means I can amplify on some of these the things I said. The most mature, as we saw from our index comparison, was Lifecycle, which is green IT procurement and green IT disposal. When we look into the components, though, of procurement and disposal, we find that disposal is a lot more mature than procurement. So by far the greenest aspect of people's green IT is their disposal practices, how well they get rid of old equipment. Recycling of paper and of ink cartridges is now pretty well the norm. People get rid of, increasingly there's legislation around the world, or increased awareness too, that people need to get rid of IT equipment, so-called e-waste, in an environmentally friendly fashion. So that's the area that people do best. As I mentioned, the area people do worst is metrics. People, because it's not that high on the agenda, people tend not to measure how well they're doing this stuff. We've actually taken our index and survey methodology and turned it into a consultancy tool that allows us to measure how well an organisation is doing and identify and pinpoint areas where they may be doing better or worse than average. So enablement was the other area that wasn't so high, because again, that's not something that IT departments marked on. It's not one of their key performance indicators. Even though it's an important area, and we try and stress it whenever we can, it's an area that a lot of IT departments don't take into account, even when they may be good at other aspects of green IT. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Graeme. I've got another question from one of our audience members here today is, how do we get an ICT sustainability from a project to a process?
Well, it's a mindset. It's as I said, it's not a journey. It's not a destination. It's a journey, and it's a case of education. It's a case of making people realise that it's a process. It's continuous. You never get there. It's something you have to do over and over. That's the difference between measurement and monitoring. Measurement's a one-off process, monitoring is a continuous process. And green IT is a continuous operation. It happens over a continuum. It's not a one-off. So that means it's got to be monitored and over a continual time. So it's again not an easy answer to the question, but it does indicate that it's a mindset. And we've got to get away from this idea that, oh, I've done green IT, move on to something else. Green IT is something that has to be done constantly. As I say, it's a mindset, it's an attitude, it's a process. It's not something you do once and then move on to something else from.
Thank you, Graeme. Perhaps you can tell us...
And that's what we're doing. That's what the whole idea of Green IT Awareness Week is.
Thanks, Graeme. Perhaps you can give us a bit of a history overview in what steps have been taken to promote green ICT in Australia, both on a government and a private enterprise approach.
Well, I can probably answer. I'm going to have that for Australia, but I can probably answer it globally too. I mean, I'm pretty across what's happening in most places around the world, and there's nothing really terribly formal that's been done. I mean, I applaud your foundation and the idea of the International Green IT Awareness Week. It's those sorts of private initiatives that are very, very important. There's a pretty large and vibrant academic community around the world. There are many sort of specialists, academic specialists in this area, many of whom I've met over the years. There are some government initiatives. They tend to be, though, for government IT. Government around the world has done a pretty good job at ensuring that the IT practices of government departments, government instrumentalities, are sustainable in their operations, but they haven't done a very good job at promoting the importance of sustainability practices in the broader community. And I think there's been abysmally low awareness in government and in private industry of the broader area of the importance of IT as an enabling tool. So, short answer to your question, what's being done worldwide to promote green IT? Not enough. There's been bits of research and academic papers, and people publish books, and the International Green IT Awareness Week, but there's no coordinated strategy from government or industry The Japanese are doing a pretty good job. They're very conscious up there. There is in Japan a Green IT Promotion Council that all the major vendors are part of. In Australia, the Australian Information Industry Association, the vendor association, has an IT sustainability working group, which I'm part of. There's pretty good stuff happening in the UK. There's an international organisation called the Green Grid, which promotes sustainable IT or green IT business practices, particularly in the data centre. So there's all sorts of bits and pieces of stuff around, but it's piecemeal, and it's not I think I'm safe in saying not a mainstream movement.
Thanks, Graeme.
Yeah.
On that then, where do you see the next big growth and maturity areas for green ICT?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I'm tempted to say, I can't see any big changes in the immediate future. But I think the biggest change, or the biggest driver of change, is going to be energy awareness of the energy consumption, the cost of energy consumption. We see in Australia and in most other countries around the world that electricity prices are increasing very quickly as coal and other fossil fuels become more expensive, as increasing amounts of resources being put into sustainable energy. But generally speaking, there's a much higher awareness of the direct cost of energy and also the indirect costs of what energy consumption is causing to the environment. So I think more than anything else, that's the key driver. We're fond of saying, and it's very true, you look at any of the drivers for sustainability, they all always come down to three key issues. One is the desire to do the right thing, altruism. Oh, I want to save the planet. I want to do the right thing by the environment. It's important to many people, less so to corporations than it is to individuals. The second key driver is government legislation, carrot or stick, either government incentives or government requirements in terms of reporting or mandated restrictions on energy consumption or energy manufacture or energy generation. But the third one, and the key driver, and the one that's more important than all the others, is money. People, funnily enough, are mostly driven or motivated by money. So the key to successful green IT is to couch it not in terms of altruism or you've got to do this or you should do this, but rather green IT saves money because it reduces energy consumption. Energy consumption's expensive and getting more so. So the best way to, or a great way of saving money is to reduce energy consumption. And IT is a big consumer of energy, so let's reduce the energy consumption of IT, which you do through green IT. I mean, this isn't rocket science, so as my wife says, it's not rocket surgery. It's pretty straightforward, and the important thing is to get that message across. And importantly, I think the message is going to be easier to get across as time goes on because the cost of energy continues to rise.
Thanks, Graeme. So what advice would you give to an organisation considering implementing green ICT practices or perhaps investing in green technologies?
Well, I think the most important thing is metrics. Let me say it for the third time in this presentation. You can't measure what you can't. You can't manage what you can't measure. And you need to put metrics in place. You need to be able to measure how effectively you are implementing what you're implementing. Now, no two organisations are the same. The relevant or the most cost-effective technologies are going to be different in every case, and you need to examine what they are. But none of this stuff is a secret. I mean, it's pretty. There's lots of sources on, including FITS's website, on how to implement green IT. But so an organisation needs to look at all the things that they could implement, work out which ones are easy for them to implement, and then implement them, but measure how well they are doing before and after implementation. Now, there's all sorts of metrics they can use. They can do our survey and give themselves an index from our framework. We welcome such inquiries, but it's not that hard to develop metrics. And the simplest and easiest metric of all is energy consumption. So, which brings me back to my first point here. Start to measure your energy consumption or put into place mechanisms that allow you to do this, and then from that, the rest logically should follow.
Okay, thank you, Graeme. Well, I'll just say to the audience, if there are any further questions remaining that you'd like to pose to Graeme while you have this opportunity, please do so now. Submit them in the question panel, in the webinar control panel. Otherwise, we will draw the session to a close in a moment. So we'll just give you a few moments to pose any final questions.
I'm still here, everybody.
Please do. Take advantage of the opportunity. It's a great resource. And when I say it, I'm referring to, of course, our lovely guest speaker, Graeme.
Yeah, I'm a he, not a it.
Okay, we've got one more final question that's come through for you, Graeme. Would you say it's more of a government or private sector push that's really leading the way when it comes to green ICT implementation?
I don't think it's either. I wouldn't make a distinction by industry sector. Certainly governments have been at the forefront of implementing policies, but in terms of encouraging people to implement green IT, I think there's just as much coming out of private enterprise. Indeed, governments tend to be very process-oriented. As I said earlier, there's not a lot of incentive or from government to make IT greener outside of government itself. They're doing a reasonably good job of ensuring that the government departments become more sustainable in their usage of IT. But some of the best initiatives are coming from private industry. I mean, Fitch is a good example. The Green Grid's a good example. There's a reasonably lively discussion on LinkedIn and even on Facebook about these issues. So most of it's coming from private industry, but then private industry is substantially bigger than government worldwide. Government seems to be getting bigger. So short answer to that question is most of the initiatives coming from private industry.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'll bring the session to a close now. So that ends officially our webinar session for this afternoon. Thank you again to our speaker, Graeme, for your time and also your willingness to share your expertise and your information.
Thank you.
No worries. Thank you, Graeme. Also, thanks to all who have participated in today's session and submitted, submitted questions. I'm glad you could join us, and we certainly hope the session was of help to you. Just a reminder to all that a recording of this session will be made available within 24 hours via the Green IT Week virtual conference page. So look forward to that if you wish to review it again at a later date. Do you have any final closing remarks or comments, Graeme?
I don't, Tim. I've said it all. Said it more than once in most cases. Just as Nike says, just do it.
That's it. Just to reiterate that message, which is really important. I think that's fantastic. Well, that concludes our session for today. So thank you again to everyone involved, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day wherever you may be. Thank you very much.